In this second episode of this Washington's Principles series, looking at our second principle of Washington's 6 that we've chosen in this podcast, we will be exploring the concept of faith. What is faith? Why is it important for America? Why is it important for the success of a nation? That's what we'll be exploring today. Let's begin. Patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Friends and Fellow Citizens. As usual, I'm your host, Sherman, here to bring you with a brand new episode talking about our second principle to start off from where we left off in our last episode of this series, talking about Washington's 6 values. The previous episode in the series was about patriotism. But now let's move on and find another principle that we can add on to our list here and learn about how faith can help guide a nation. Whether we are going through happy times or difficult times, whether we are home or abroad, we can still have faith in ourselves, in our communities, and in our nation. But before we get into our episode, if you enjoy this podcast, please make sure that you subscribe to the show and share it with your friends and family. Remember, every Monday, released at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. Today, I want to explore faith, but I want to look at this perhaps from a different angle. Normally, we associate faith with a particular religion, and I am going to be touching upon that a lot in this episode. And of course, when you look at the definitions of faith, there are really two definitions that come into mind. First is more on the confidence and the trust aspect. This, I think, makes a lot of sense because when you look at the origins of the word faith, as you kind of track through some of those old languages, you get down to Latin coming from the word fidere, which means to trust. And with that in mind, I've got three main points I want to highlight in this episode, three pillars that I think are going to be really great springboards for us as we explore the concept of faith throughout all of our episodes and for future episodes that predominantly discuss perhaps one or multiple aspects of faith. The first principle, I think, is something that is particularly obvious maybe for a lot of people, but I think it's something that cannot be ignored. And I think that there are just so many benefits with this particular fact, and that is that there is no America without religion and morality. When you think about the origins of laws, as I've touched upon in a previous episode or two, why is murder bad? Why is stealing bad? Why are crimes against humanity bad, if you want to go in a much more macro level? Now, I'm not your philosophy professor, and I certainly hope that if you are asked these questions in school that you don't get them wrong, but it really is important to perhaps wonder, where did these ideas come from? And I think this is the purpose of this pillar here, which is to help define what the moral pillars and foundation are for a society. And since this podcast is based on Washington's farewell address, hence the name Friends and Fellow Citizens, the first few words of George Washington's address to the American people from then and up to the current and future generations, I thought I would re-examine a few quotes here from his text just to see what he is saying to all of us. Let's take this first quote as an example. Washington says, quote, Observe good faith and justice towards all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct, and can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it? It will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and at no distant period a great nation, to give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. Unquote. Two things I want to point out here. The first is that, of course, religion and morality enjoin this conduct. And can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it? In other words, when we enact policies as a country, it's going to be natural and mandatory for all of us to incorporate some kind of religious and moral backing to them. I think that's why when we have discussions about policymaking, as I've mentioned at least a couple times over the last few episodes, when we talk about especially foreign policy aspects, we really have to think about how difficult these situations are, because when a country intervenes, let's say, in a conflict or perhaps participates in a humanitarian mission of some kind, there are always going to be difficult barriers when it comes down to making a moral decision. Because on the one hand, someone could argue, we are doing this, we might be committing a moral dilemma here, we might be facing a moral dilemma here, but we are doing this for a long-term moral good. And that's just one of the ways in which people can debate about morality. And of course, part of the debate on morality is within the debate on politics. And so we see the origins of these debates, but also the origins of people's intentions who want to do or want to take a particular action. And there's no question that this debate will continue. But I think we have to, of course, as we all know, have to have that moral backing and that moral foundation to practice those good values. And it certainly is no secret that the moral and legal backing of this country, the moral spine, shall we say, of the United States, is perhaps best outlined in our Charters of Freedom, notably the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and Washington. And how is it that our Charters of Freedom can have such a moral backing and a moral foundation if there is no particular religion attached to the name? Of course, as you know, we, as the United States, do not establish a national religion. And just like many of the other principles our founders outlined in our Charters of Freedom, this lesson on religion just certainly didn't come easy. Not only did the founders study the history of great empires, of other religious groups who engaged in all these fights, there were, of course, fights within the colonies at the time. You think about the Pilgrims, for example. They escaped from England to escape to what is now Plymouth Rock and in Massachusetts to escape religious persecution from the Church of England. You think about the Quakers in Pennsylvania, and think about how they fled from persecution in England, fled to the colonies, and actually, just like other religious groups, also faced persecution. There's this one document here that I did not hear much about until I did some reading and research before preparing for this episode, and that is the Flushing Remonstrance of 1657. I wish we had the document actually in the National Archives or at the Museum of the City of New York or something, because this document is important, but unfortunately it was lost in a tragic fire in Albany in 1911. Really, really sad. I really wish that this document could be proclaimed more, because as the more I read about it, the more interesting it got, especially in its significance as a cornerstone of religion in America. So at the time, Flushing, which is not Flushing, Queens now, Flushing was part of the New Netherland, which of course was the Dutch colonies at the time in the New York area. And the Dutch colonies were run by a man whom I think many New Yorkers might have heard of, named Director General Peter Stuyvesant. And Stuyvesant established this colony and helped to rule it, but he had a few problems. Coming from the Dutch Reformed Church himself, he could not tolerate religious groups, especially the Quakers. He made it a policy that Quakers could not even meet in their homes. There was this one Flushing colonist who held a Quaker meeting at his home. He was somehow found out, he was fined, and then he was banished from that colony. And people were just outraged by it. They thought, how could this colony even tolerate just people who practice different beliefs, who might take the same exact principles, maybe principles of forgiveness and goodness, practice it in a different way, and get persecuted for it? This didn't make any sense at all for them. And so they've filed a remonstrance, now called the Flushing Remonstrance, a petition against Director General Stuyvesant to fight for what is right, and that was freedom of religion. Such a simple concept, and yet that fight was only the beginning. I mean, we look at what has unfortunately occurred when freedom of religion is not tolerated. Freedom of religion is the ability for someone to practice any religion and the ability for someone to choose to not practice any religion. Again, it sounds very simple, but we have come a long way as a world to realize, at least for certain people, not everybody, unfortunately, even in 2020, hopefully in the future, but we've come a long way to understanding how deadly and how destructive religious wars are. But not just religious wars. We're also talking about religious persecutions and religious-based genocides even. Some of the most horrid episodes of human history has been persecutions against people just simply of a different religion, not even trying to understand what they believe. It's really astonishing. It's really astonishing what certain countries and what certain people can do. And these people are heartless. And these kind of people I'm talking about people from the Soviet Union. They had kind of mini episodes in the late 1910s when you had the revolution and whatnot, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. You had these terrible situations where the Soviet Union was going after Christians, burning down even synagogues, burning down mosques even, going after anyone who is religious, because that is the fundamental pillar of Marxism. We won't go into depth on Marxism too much in this episode, but I just have to say one thing here. Given what I'm seeing on college campuses, given what certain professors are teaching nowadays, and political science departments especially, on this idea of Marxism, it's one thing to teach people just what Marxism is, but then you have people who are trying to profess this horrible ideology, immoral ideology, that has no understanding of the world, no understanding of the human being, what it means to be moral, no understanding of what the difference is between good and bad. After personally going through some Marxist professors in college, I can tell you that Marxism is no longer a political science term that people with political science degrees have to learn. It is a cruel ideology. And trust me, I think people should understand it. But understand what Marxism has done to just achieve power, and they have done so against religious groups of all kinds. And it really is remarkable how there are people who sympathize with Marxism. I mean, it is immoral to go after a religious group simply because they practice a different religion. And it's certainly immoral to go after their property, to go after their family and friends. I mean, there's no heart with these people. And it's certainly almost as bad. It's certainly horrible and inhumane for people to hijack a particular religion for political purposes. And Stalin is a good example. We have seen that while they might not be classified as overtly Marxist, however, I think they act in incredibly authoritarian ways that might as well just be alongside the inhumane list with the Marxists. And those are countries that have established a particular religion, in many cases Islam, in some of the cases other religions. But these particularly Islamist countries, not Islamic, I make a difference here. Islamist meaning imposing Islam on people through violent means very often. These particular states are also completely without any heart, without any moral values. We are fighting against these people. I really think that when we talk about faith, we talk about these principles, all of them, in fact, not just faith, but all of them. We are in a struggle against evil here. We understand that wisdom is understanding what's good and what is evil. That, I think, is a part of great wisdom and great enlightenment. And I just praise so many people out there, many leaders, many of my fellow citizens, as well as people from across the world, perhaps many of them whom I will never meet in my life, who are fighting and continuing to fight for freedom of religion, continuing to fight for not just religion, the free practice of religion, but trying to institute good values in people so that we do not get drawn away from extremist so-called religious groups, because there are extremist groups ranging from Al-Qaeda to ISIS to Al-Shabaab to other groups who really do not reflect the true purpose of religion, and that is to make people better, to bring goodness and to bring love and to bring forgiveness across the entire world. And so even despite the numerous attempts for particular individuals to institute a particular church or to have the government fund a particular church, the founders knew that they had to protect the individual right to exercise freedom of religion. And I think this leads to my second point of this episode, and it is that we should have free exercise of religion, but not the fullest toleration of religion. This point comes from James Madison, who was a very fervent supporter of freedom of religion. And what's interesting about Madison was that he looked at morality as part of the individual protected conscience. And it's not that he didn't have his opinions or other people didn't have any opinions, but it's important that he insists that his opinions were his own. We might often believe that religion is a bit surrounded by this concept of humans gathered in groups, which we are. I mean, we are social animals. But he believed that the morality aspect comes from people. I thought that was very interesting. But then I thought to myself, it's true. When we look at how the United States focuses on the individual, I'll give a quick example. When Madison was a state legislator in 1776, he was working on the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And other people had agreed that they should put the terms fullest toleration of other people's religion. But to Madison, that simply did not reflect what a free people should tolerate from the government. He believed that the wording should be changed to free exercise of religion, because it's just simply not the case for government to simply tolerate, simply accept other religions and concentrate on funding a particular church or supporting a particular denomination. I thought that was really interesting, and it made me think about perhaps some of the parallels compared to the present day. Perhaps in this day and age, we should be respecting other religions, but not just simply tolerating it. One of the challenges that I've encountered is when a particular individual shares about their religious experience, but does not recognize that someone else may come from a different religion. And unfortunately, I have heard a few very disturbing stories about how particular individuals are approaching this idea of religion in the United States, despite the fact that we do have Judeo-Christian beliefs in terms of our Constitution. However, our government does not endorse or support a particular denomination of religion. But part of that, I think, also has to reflect on people's actions. My mother once told me this story. She was conducting a charity event as part of her organization, which is affiliated with her religion. And this charity has a culture of showing a particular way of showing respect. And one day she was approached by a man she was helping, and this man told her that, well, my religion doesn't do it this way. We don't show appreciation that way. We don't talk about these values that way, because my religion is the ultimate religion of the United States, or something along those lines. And my mother thought, how strange is it that someone could be so intolerant, but not just intolerant, but also holding a particular dislike towards someone else, even though these two religions, between those two individuals, could have very similar values of forgiveness, of love, of appreciation, of respect. And yet this man refused to take the time to get to know others, even if they're people whom do not share the same exact religion. I think that it is truly a kind of suffering for certain people to not even be open to listening to other people's ideas about these values of love, of forgiveness, and all the rest. Apparently, that individual was scared that if he, God forbid, were to show respect in a different religion, that he would all of a sudden turn to a member of a different religion. I mean, it's just silly. It's really silly to see that people can't even open their minds. I think it brings into question about this particular man's true beliefs. I've heard another story where a family member of mine went to an interfaith gathering of multiple religions, and you would think that people would civilly talk about all kinds of matters. But all of a sudden, there's this particular individual from some religion that I can't recall, but he comes up. He's a leading figure in his faith organization, and all of a sudden, he just starts espousing the worst names and the worst speeches about the President of the United States, like a political speech. And I thought to myself, that is one of the worst abuses of religion I've ever heard about. In daily life, of course. Religion is supposed to teach us to unite, to make us better individuals. I understand that people can have their own political beliefs, but when it comes to political debates, there is no place for that in a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a temple, or any religious site of any kind. And while religion historically has also been used for political purposes, we can depart from that. We can build on the value of freedom and free expression of religion by making it and ensuring that it is a refuge from the very difficult and complex times of our lives. I was very appalled by that story, and I hope that people will remember that freedom of religion really is incredibly valuable. And when certain individuals like these two men in these two past examples I just mentioned, if they become the norm, I think we are in very big trouble. But I don't believe that they will be. I think people will understand that freedom of religion is one to cherish, and we can never let it become politicized. Otherwise, we lose a very essential part of our source of conscience and source of morality that we don't want to ever lose, ever. And on my third and final point, faith will be a light, a guiding light for the United States of America and the world. When we have faith that life will play out and good will prevail over evil, when we pray for those who are suffering and hope that they will be able to recover and be able to live out their lives to the fullest, I think that is a powerful feeling to have across the nation. And although I've been talking about how religion is separate from government in the sense that here in the United States, we do not endorse a state religion, we do not have a state religion, I want to take a moment to recognize that I think one of the most unifying and most beautiful moments is when the Senate chaplain and the House chaplain open each session with a prayer. As of September 2020, the current Senate chaplain is Rear Admiral Barry Black, and the House chaplain is currently Reverend Pat Conroy. Both serve an incredible, important purpose by serving the Senate and the House and opening with a prayer before each session. Probably one of the most unifying experiences right now in Washington, but I think that is one of the most prized aspects of our government. It's that while the government does not endorse a particular religion, the concept of morality and of ethics embedded in the spine of the Constitution and of our American system of government, the fact that it is well and respected across both parties, across both chambers, across the entire country, I think is really valuable. I highly encourage you to take a listen at these prayers and just hear how, as every day, with multiple challenges facing the nation, the legislature, often called the People's House, is reminded of the guidance and reminded of the importance of having faith in themselves, in their constituents, and in the country. I just think it's a beautiful tradition that the United States has had since the beginning of the country, since 1789. We've had a chaplain for each ever since the beginning, and I don't think that should ever stop, because it is a very gracious feeling to know that even as things are difficult and things are challenging nowadays, at least the country has a moral guidance, a source of incredible faith that we can all unite behind. And so I want to close today with those 3 points. Number 1, that there is no America without religion and morality. And that number 2, we should have free exercise of religion, not the fullest toleration of religion. And number 3 is that faith will be a guiding light for all of us. In the most difficult times, in the happiest of times, regardless of the circumstances, we have our morality. We have our ethics, we have our conscience, and we have each other. And I hope that faith will unite us in the most unimaginable ways possible. And throughout this podcast, we'll be exploring ways in which people from all around the world have used faith to try to bridge divides and have tried to bring people together, even when the circumstances might dictate that that is impossible or difficult. But as long as we believe in those good values of freedom, of equal opportunity, of justice, of goodness, of kindness, of love, I don't think there's anything that can stop us. And throughout this podcast, I hope that we will learn from each other and learn about our beliefs and our faiths, no matter where we come from, and solve the world's biggest issues together. I want to close with a quote from Washington's farewell address. He said, quote, "Let us simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Unquote. I think this quote sums it up because we have to know the source of our laws and our policies and our behavior and our actions as a people. Otherwise, we might be maybe constantly just caught up with the complexities and with the different afflictions that are often mixed with nowadays. Everything from politics to business to education to some degree. There's just a lot of different elements that are going on in our lives, and we need to understand where the source of good behavior is. We need to know that stark difference between good versus evil. And oftentimes that decision is difficult. I've mentioned that this difference here can be between doing what is easy and doing what is right. But if we do what is right, I think there's nothing that we cannot accomplish together. And we will preserve the valuable morality that we all believe in this country and in countries around the world. And with that, thank you so much for listening to this episode talking about our second principle about faith. I hope you enjoyed it and you've learned a lot from this episode. If you enjoy it, and if you enjoyed this podcast, again, make sure you subscribe and share this show with your friends and family. Until next time, please take care, and I'll talk to you at the next episodes of Friends and Fellow Citizens. Have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.